Kia ora tātou. Ko Waikato te awa, ko Tainui te waka, ko Tainui te iwi, ko Ngāti Whāroa te hapu, ko Horaki tōku whānau. I tupu ake o I Tamaki Makoro, ko Jess Woodward tōku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Hello everyone, my name is Jess Woodward and I'm an artist at Art Journeys. I'm still pretty early on my journey to reconnect with my ancestry. I whakapapa te Tainui, but I grew up in Paparoa, Howick, in Tamaki Makoro, Auckland. I think of my maunga as Ohuirangi, and my awa, or my moana rather, as Waipaparoa. My grandma, that's me on the left and her on the right in case you can't guess, used to take me up Ohuirangi, and one of my favourite memories of her is going up the top there and thinking I was on the highest mountain in the world, even though actually it's more of a hill. My childhood home was up the road from Waipaparoa, and it's still the place that my heart goes to every time I think of the water. In my spare time, I like to nerd out with my husband, fawn over our two cats, Juno and Teaspoon, who are my pride and joy, read way too many webtoons and spend a lot of coins doing it, and I main a cleric and a tinkerer in 2 separate D&D campaigns. Professionally, I'm a big believer in marrying creativity with context to make clever work that works. My background is in graphic design, so if you've been into a Spark store at some point in the last decade or attended New Zealand Games Festival, you've probably seen some of my work. A year ago now, I took the plunge to switch into the games industry, and I've been doing some awesome mahi at Art Journeys on our game Tūwhiri, which is what inspired this talk. Before we get too far down the rabbit hole, I thought I'd set some expectations. This is a talk about creating respectful art based on sacred knowledge, whilst on a set timeframe and budget. What it is not is a talk about how to gain access to that sacred knowledge. I am not the right person to be doing that talk. Successful consultation relies heavily on existing relationships, whakawhānaugatanga, and if you don't have those existing relationships, you should be hiring someone who does to support you. All going well, we should have time for a quick Q&A at the end of the talk, so if you have any questions, please keep them in mind until then. With that out of the way, let's talk about motion stories and why Art Journeys uses them. We use motion stories as content trailers within Tūwhiri, and this trailer should give you a bit of an idea what the game is like.
Tūwhiri, available on the App Store and Google Play.
So, Tūwhiri is a geolocation game that puts stories of place into the places they relate to. We work with the kaitiaki, the guardians of these stories, to craft an engaging, educational experience for players. To play, players have to travel to the journey location and walk through the stunning Aotearoa scenery as they collect the chapters of the story. But before they commit to making a trip to that location, they want to know what the story is all about. So that's where our motion stories come in. A motion story, or an animated short, is a narrative-driven animated trailer designed to hook the player's curiosity and their attention. These days, they're often big and flashy high-budget affairs like this example from League of Legends.
Here, you will find your challenge.
But for indies, working on limited budgets like we do, A more cost-effective approach is needed, something a bit simpler, like this early World of Warcraft one.
This was the ancient empire of Pandaria, nestled in the most fertile of river valleys at the far end of the world. Behold, the last emperor on the day of his coronation. His name was Xiao Hao.
Keeping within your budget on Indigenous story-based projects can be pretty tricky because the priorities of Indigenous storytelling are often direct conflicts with the priorities of low-budget production. Here are some of the challenges that I've observed while working on our second motion story, Ngā Kōrero o Te Puaha o Waikato, Stories of Port Waikato, which we created on behalf of Ngāti Karewa and Ngāti Tahinga for Port Waikato Holiday Park. Challenge number 1. These kōrero span centuries of knowledge, and you're only making 60 seconds of trailer. Oops. Bear with. Stories of Port Waikato centres around the Wakatoa, war waka, Te Wheneka, who was first built almost 200 years ago. Our client shared so many fascinating details with us that she was built by the combined effort of 3 iwi 5 years after the Treaty of Waitangi was signed, that the local chiefs of the time who signed the treaty are portrayed in the journey location at Port Waikato Holiday Park, that during the land wars she was cut from her moorings and drifted a whopping 63 kilometres down the Waikato River, whilst 1.2 million acres of land and countless lives were stolen from her people. That when she washed up, her carvings were removed by Komatua and buried to protect them from the colonial invaders, and that her original oars are still in their care today. That when she was eventually retrieved for restoration, her wood was so tough that it broke the modern power tools they tried to use when cutting her apart to move her. That she was recarved 3 times before eventually being gifted to Waikato Museum, Te Whare Taonga o Waikato, where she was recarved a 4th time after an accident. All of these were many tiny fractions of the vast story that she's lived through in her time. Centuries of story. And as I said, we've only got 60 seconds. The solution was to look for the evocative moments. Put the drama in the trailer and save the detail for other channels. Having been the one who did the initial consultation session, our game designer Ben did the original storyboard. It's a trailer, not the whole movie, right? So we distilled it down to key moments, the most important or the most evocative, the things that would trigger recognition in those who are familiar with Te Ao Māori or intrigue people to find out more. For us, that came down to the karakia being said to remove tapu from her tree before it was felled. The land wars in which the British burned anything that looked Māori and fired upon even unarmed non-combatants as they fled the battlefield. The swamp Totomoaka, where the Komatua buried Te Wheneka's carvings to protect them from being destroyed. Her restoration team, breaking her apart with hand tools in order to be able to move and restore her. The regatta day, in which she journeyed along the Waikato River to her final resting place, or current resting place, I should say, and the new generation of descendants who now get to experience the past by visiting her at the museum. Of course, just because something's important doesn't mean it's right for the trailer. We actually ended up cutting that last shot because we realized it gives away the ending of the story. And, you know, it's also a whole nother shot that we then have to try and fit into the budget. But just because something doesn't suit the trailer, it doesn't mean you have to discard it altogether. We've built multiple channels into our storytelling so we can capture the full story. We start with high detail earlier in the funnel, high drama earlier in the funnel, and then move to high detail as we get later down the funnel. You might see this in the trailer. and then hear this endgame.
Te Wēneka was born for war. And she saw her fair share of battles. Even after the 3 local chiefs you see carved here in the entrance signed the Treaty of Waitangi, Aotearoa saw great land wars and much suffering of our people. During the Port Waikato invasion of the 1860s, many Māori carvings were burnt as a British act of war. So, when invaders cut Te Wēneka from her moorings at Rangiriri, leaving her to drift to Port Waikato, the chiefs ordered the carved fragments of Te Wēneka be removed and hidden. But where would our tipuna hide them?
And then from that screen, there's a Learn More button you can hit to hear more about it on the website. Each layer builds upon the detail of the story, so those with the appetite to do so can keep learning, and no parts of the story get neglected due to time constraints. Like most people on small teams, I wear many hats, and I had the privilege of getting to research and write the web pages for this journey, which led to one of the most meaningful moments I've had in this job. I mentioned to my dad that I was researching the land wars, the Battle of Rangiriri, and Te Puaha o Waikato, and he said, "Oh, I think that was part of our hapu's history." Looking over my aunt's notes about our hapu, Ngāti Whāroa, I realised, oh, this is not someone else's history I'm writing about. This is my family's history too. These events are the reason I'm so disconnected from my whakapapa, because by the end of the land wars, my hapu no longer existed. It had been dissolved. I was effectively writing about my own colonisation. I'd read over these notes before from my aunt, but I hadn't really understood them until this moment, and honestly I feel really honoured and grateful to have had this opportunity to gain a better understanding of my own past. Our second challenge is because these stories are about real people and real events, accuracy is important. But, there's a lot of buts in this talk, accuracy comes at a cost of research and consultation. Important, but hard to fit into your ND budget. One of our solutions for this is strategic ambiguity. Clarity is expensive, so we save it for where it matters most. Both of our stories so far have focused on a central character, but character design is an investment of its own. It's expensive. Additionally, it's common for different iwi to have different interpretations of a character, and we don't want to invalidate one version of history by being too specific about another version of it. In our first story, artist Phil James got around this by depicting the human character from behind and obscuring the taniwha in water. Some iwi described this taniwha as a whale, while others described it as a stingray. The water allowed us to obscure that. By including core ideas like the ancestor's clubfoot and the taniwha's glowing belt, he was still able to communicate their roles in the story without invalidating anyone's understanding of who they were as characters. In our latest story, our character was the waka Te Wēneka, who is ornately carved, making her really hard and therefore expensive to draw. Using strategic ambiguity, we deliberately framed the shots to avoid showing her carvings as much as possible. We represented her through her silhouette, or showed her at a time where she canonically didn't have her carvings. Similarly, all of the people in the trailer were silhouettes for the same reason. As soon as we gave these people identities, we'd need to start designing them as characters, and then suddenly we'd be losing hours and hours to the character design minds. And sometimes ambiguity is actually the culturally responsible thing to do. In this scene, set in 1845, the tohunga says a karakia over the tōtara that Te Wēneka would be built from. This karakia has been passed down from tipuna to tūhanga across generations, and the words are still known even now, 177 years later. During consultation, we discussed whether to include the original karakia in the game, but ultimately recommended against it. Many karakia, like this one, are sacred. It's knowledge to be passed down by and protected by the rangatira and the kaumātua of the iwi, and shared only with those who have descended from it. With strategic ambiguity in mind, we used part of a common, publicly shared karakia that acknowledges the separation of our parents, rangi and papa, and the creation of the world instead. It's still appropriate for the context, but we didn't compromise our taonga to do it. Another place where strategic ambiguity came in handy was the war scene. We needed to depict which side was being invaded, and our client had mentioned that the British were burning anything that looked Māori. If we had gone down the rabbit hole of which exact carvings were being burned, it would have meant getting into a level of really specific research that we didn't have budget for, and given that the carvings were destroyed, we may not have been able to find appropriate visual reference for them anyway. We chose to depict a whare being burned instead, as a recognisable symbol to represent something covered in Māori carvings. Statistically, it's likely that at least one whare was burnt during the land wars, and it made for a clear visual shorthand without us having to invest time in accurately depicting the carvings or researching the specifics of the situation. But research is still valuable and incredibly necessary. Which is why our other solution to this challenge is to be purposeful in our research. It's really easy to lose time researching too specific details. To keep the balance between storytelling needs and budget constraints while researching, question how will your research serve the narrative? For example, we had a general concept of what the blessing of Te Whenika's tree might look like, but I was having trouble giving it the appropriate sense of mana. While researching, I was lucky enough to find the 1974 documentary Tā Here Tiki Tiki, The Making of a Māori Canoe, which featured a very similar scene for another wakatawa, the Tā Here Tiki Tiki, as the name might suggest. The full scene is around 5 minutes long, but here's a tiny snippet from the start, just to give you a sense of it.
Words chanted, the karakia, the ritual performed.
Waira to waira tai waira te no tapu ka hura ta ka te me tu ki ta ka tai ka hura ta ka tai me tu ki ta ka ta pera ki ra te ko pe te ko pro ta wa ia wa to ya pa ka mo ata ma ki te ara pa ka mo ata ma ki te ara ko tu ko ro ko ta mai ara ye te ara tu wa ta ba hi tu ku ta ba ke pu te ki bo ta pa et pu ta wa ki ro ta wi ra mai te pua, mai te tawhito, I hara mai rā koe I whea, I hara mai rā koe te whakautinu koe te whakautirangi, o tō marawa, ko tōku marawa, e tāre kairi, whāno, ala mai tā tōki, haungi e, hui e, taiki e.
Te Whenika herself actually features in this documentary, which is how I was able to find it. And I later found out that Tā Here Tiki Tiki actually accompanied her on her journey on the regatta day to the museum. Weird, cool little facts you find out when you're doing this kind of research. It was important too that the tohunga giving the karakia was recognisable as a spiritual leader. Finding videos of kaumātua speaking and giving karakia became really valuable post-reference for this scene. Both of these bits of research helped me to communicate the overarching narrative. If I'd gone too specific, I could have spent days researching the specific tohunga who removed the tapu on Te Whenika's tree, or how to represent the 3 different iwi that came together to build her. These are still really valid parts of the story, and they're still important, but they don't move the narrative of the trailer specifically forward. Specificity can be appropriate at times though. Te Whenika's carvings are a core part of her identity, so it would have been disrespectful for us to approximate them for the one shot we did need to show them in. I was able to reduce drawing time by depicting the simpler design of her taurapa at the rear of her, but most photos focus on her tauihu at the front. Getting my own photos would have required a 2-hour drive from Auckland to Hamilton, so I was over the moon to discover that somebody had actually uploaded a handycam video of their museum visit to YouTube. YouTube was surprisingly a goldmine of really valuable research for this project, actually. And specific research can also help you when you're stuck, like I was on this shot. The blank slate of this original carving animation was just kind of boring, but I wasn't sure how to improve it without just scrapping the entire shot and starting again, which also wasn't a viable option at the tail end of the project. By watching videos of carvers working, I realized it's common for carvers to map out the whole design before they start fleshing out the deeper parts of the carving. It's essentially the same shot, just portrayed slightly differently, and having this line work across the whole surface made for a much more engaging visual with minimal production changes. Our third challenge. These stories have mana and deserve a powerful treatment, even though you are a tiny team and your own skill limitations are all you have to work with. A really effective way to make up for a lack of technical expertise is to keep it simple but stylish. A basic, graphically impactful piece will feel more memorable than a technically accurate but boring piece. The existing motion story that Ara Journeys had done before I joined was done with our previous artist Phil, and it used a really beautiful, graphically impactful, painterly style done through a mixture of digital painting and 3D camera work. Phil moved on a while ago, and I was hired as an artist on the strength of my graphic design background. But as a graphic designer, I was not a painter. I also had no 3D experience, had only done motion graphics as an art director for retail ads, and had a fairly basic set of drawing skills. Don't get me wrong, like, my illustration stuff is cool, it's really distinct, but this does not look like this. So we decided to invest some R&D time just to see how I could pull this off. And it's probably a good thing that we did, because my initial approach was to attempt to replicate Phil's style, and attempt is really the operative word there. Whilst this isn't the worst piece of game art to have ever existed, it's unmemorable, and it was really time-consuming to do. It also held a whole lot of detail that didn't contribute to telling the story at all. I think I spent about 2 full days on this piece and ultimately came to the conclusion that, yeah, my painting skills are not good enough to replicate Phil's style. But you know whose style my painting skills are good enough to replicate? Mine. My manager Ben encouraged me to think about it differently. If I was going to approach this like I would for a piece of graphic design, what would I do? I relied heavily on photography when I was working in graphic design, and I dabbled in taking photos of my own back when I cosplayed. So I started thinking about how would I tackle this if this was a photo shoot. I'd frame it more dramatically, I'd reduce the detail to a main focal point, and I'd use lighting to help guide attention to that focal point and hide a whole bunch of detail. We'd had this idea that each frame in the storyboard would be a different season of Te Winika's life, and that this would be the autumn or winter of her lifetime. That got me thinking about cold weather sunsets on the water, and if I focused more on the water, I could reduce the shoreline to just silhouettes. I did a bit of research and set about doing some value-only thumbnails just to get a feel for the composition and what might work here. Fun fact, did you know that the Waikato River is on Google Street View and you can virtually sail down the entire river? Also really helpful because I've never been there before. My next iteration was a marked improvement on the previous one, thanks to its significantly stronger composition and lighting. I'd say this was shippable, but still not super memorable. Ben asked me again, how would you Jessify this? Until this point, I'd been treating it like it was a painting, so I've decided to change tack. In my personal illustrations, I was working entirely in Posca paint markers, choosing visual interest over technical accuracy, using geometric shapes or silhouettes with very limited shading, and a restricted hue range of intense colours. This was memorable. We did a bit of tweaking to make it better fit with the organic aesthetic of the rest of the game by adding some more texture. And then we explored how we might dial the colour back just a bit, because it was a little intense for the rest of the game. And then from there, we did a test animation to see how I might bring motion into it, given that I had used After Effects for about a week before this point. All up, we invested about a week and a half on this R&D for just this one shot. But investing that time and finding a powerful yet fast to produce graphics style meant that I was able to bang out and animate the other 4 shots in just 2.5 weeks. It's simplicity with style. A key part of keeping that production time down was keeping the animation simple too. Inspired by how Opus Echo Starsong's CGs used moving VFX and otherwise still parallaxes, I used simple fade transitions for minimalistic VFX and character movement. And with no experience in using 3D cameras, you make do with what you have. So I made some super professional looking reference footage for the parallax effects that I wanted, and then replicated that in After Effects. The other thing that helps us tell our stories well is to remember that life is more than paint. If we had a massive budget, I would have loved to animate way more, but we don't have the scope to animate Te Whenika's tree being chopped down or the Kaumatua taking her carvings to the swamp to bury them. This is where sound and directionality were a huge help. Sound is what changes this from being a group of people in a tohunga standing around a tree to a tree-felling ceremony deep within the ancient forests of Aotearoa.
Ona mata. I te wā I aua hatia tō mātou waka. Ko te Whenika.
And directionality takes this shot from being just someone digging a hole to telling the narrative of Te Whenika's carvings being buried as a direct consequence of the war. Without having used filmmaking tools like these, our motion stories wouldn't have been nearly as effective, and I'm really glad we didn't have to rely on the paintings alone. Our final challenge, challenge number 4, is the most important one of them all. The story needs to feel right to its kaitiaki, but changes take time, and there's only so much of that in the budget. When an iwi shares their stories with you, you're being granted an immense privilege. You have a duty to ensure that you treat that privilege with the utmost respect, and to represent the story in a way that's faithful to how its kaitiaki view it. The key to this is to work together. Whakawhānau isn't just rocking up for a business meeting. It's a journey of deep personal relationship building to create authentic connections, and once trust has been built, you might decide to work together. And once you decide to work together, consultation isn't just a one and done, off you go kind of thing. You don't just do a consultation session and then go off and make something you think looks cool. By checking in with the client along the way, you give them opportunities to build upon your drafts, to help shape the story, and to keep your representation of the story on track. And by setting production process expectations at the start of the project, you can ensure the work keeps moving without backtracking. The insights your client brings to the table will make your storytelling much richer. A really good example of this is the war scene. In our initial storyboard, all we really had in mind for this shot was it's burning and it's war. Most of the available reference imagery of the events from the time was depicted from the British perspective, which made things feel like a gallant battle and we're all going off and being heroes when, actually it was literally an invasion. While speeding back on the original storyboard, Whaerereo Keroa introduced us to a powerful reenactment done on the 150-year anniversary of the Battle of Rangiriri, performed by the descendants of the survivors of the tragedy. And I'd like to play you a little bit of it because it really significantly shaped how we did this scene.
E ko tahi rau e 50 tau mai te pahutanga mai o te mai oro oro i te ahurewa o Rangiriri. Ko te mai oha o te reo take take i mū, i huna, i aukati, i kura. Ka huakina mai ngā tatau kōrero ngā tatau paunamu.
Without the client's insight, my instinct would have been to depict a battle scene between two sides, but after watching that reenactment, it was clear that focusing on the human cost of the war was a more meaningful and more truthful representation of events. But as valuable as feedback is, feedback loops are a balancing act. If you move too far along the process without making sure that everyone is on board, you can lose a lot of time, which you can't afford when you're on a set budget. To keep the balance, we use a milestone sign-off process. We don't proceed till the next stage until the first milestone has been signed off, and we set the expectation at the start of the project that revisions can't be done on already signed off work. So for us, that process looks like having whakawhanaungatanga, agreeing to a business partnership, and then doing an initial consultation session. From there, we create a storyboard and a style example, which we send to the client and they can feed back on, and we can make changes pretty easily at this stage because it's so early. Then we ask them to give like a go-ahead milestone sign-off and move on to the next stage. From there, we time it out and we put in some placeholder audio, start getting a sense for the beats and the timing of it. And again, feedback, amends, another milestone sign-off. After that, we turn it into an animatic and start adding sound effects as well, and this is where things start getting a bit more concrete. By this stage, we're expecting maybe tweaks, but nothing massive in terms of changes. We get another milestone sign-off, and then we move to the final paint-over and the final audio, and this is basically the stage where the sign-off is more of a like, yeah, cool, thanks for keeping us in the loop, rather than actually changes. But despite the best efforts of everyone involved, sometimes the vision isn't always clear until the next stage, and you get feedback that conflicts with the previous sign-off. When the precious taonga of our stories are involved, you can't just say, oh no, sorry, no takebacks. It has to be right, and it has to be balanced with production needs. So what do? Rather than taking feedback at face value, we can analyze it to try and figure out what's at the core of the feedback and find other solutions that address that core issue. In our case, after completing the animatic and adding the sound effects, we received a revised storyboard from the client. This would have effectively been a redo of the entire project and not feasible for the budget constraints. So we looked at other solutions. One of the frames that wasn't working for the client was the war scene. This was the animatic that they saw.
Ki tana haerenga ki te wāhi I huna I aia.
Here, the client requested 3 frames in place of 1, which would have been a bit of a production budget blowout, especially when the suggested frames were actually quite similar content-wise to what we already had. Instead, we looked at how to add what was missing from using the existing frame. It needed to be clearer that it was war, and a one-sided one at that, and we needed to make it clearer what had happened to Te Wheneka at this time. She was our main character. We used audio to make it clearer that it was a war scene by including part of the haka from the Rangiriri reenactments, very generously provided to us by Brad Totorewa, who composed it, and by changing the voiceover script of both the trailer and the in-game chapters, we were able to make it clearer what had happened to Te Wheneka during this time.
Tai mai ngā hoi a tauiwi, kia patu o tātou tupuna. Tā rehutia ngā whakairo o te unika, kia whakahauma.
So we managed to retain the original shot for that part. Awesome. However, it became clear that this part of the trailer was fundamentally flawed.
He oi, ka putanga mai anō ia.
Te Wīnaka was moved from Port Waikato to Ngaruawahia for her renewal and had to be cut into pieces in order to be transported over land. We really liked the idea of this scene because the chopping motion made for a really dramatic crescendo right before we introduced the title, and we really liked the fact that traditional tools had to be used because she was so tough that she broke the power saws that they were using. But reviewing the client's revision of this scene, we realized out of context, it appeared as though she was being destroyed rather than rebirthed. And having been recarved now 4 times in her lifetime, a carving scene was personally really significant and meaningful for her character. So I did a super bodgy tech test to see how we might be able to do a carving animation without losing a whole bunch of time, which I've included here because it's so janky, I thought you might enjoy it. And the resulting shot is a more peaceful one, but far more appropriate for the reverence given to Te Wīnaka's renewal. And because I was able to find a simple, cost-effective way to depict it, we were able to course correct without blowing out the budget. With all these changes, we got the sign-off from the client to finish up the paintovers, and after all this talking about it, I'm very proud to show you the final trailer for Ngā Kōrero o Te Puaha o Waikato.
He kōrero tā mātou, I tīmata I ngā wā o na mata. I te wā I auahatia tō mātou waka, ko te winika. Tai mai ngā hoi a tauiwi, kia patu o tātou tupuna. Tā rehutia ngā whakairo o te unika, kia whakahaumarutia ai. He oi, ka putanga mai anō ia. Hara mai, whakarongo mai ki te kōrero a te unika.
Thanks. In conclusion, balancing storytelling needs with production needs is tricky, but it's totally achievable, even on an indie budget. We've got centuries of narrative, but only 60 seconds of trailer to tell it in. So we focus on the evocative moments. We use drama in the trailer and detail in other channels. Accuracy matters, but accuracy is expensive, so we use strategic ambiguity. Clarity is expensive, so we save it for where it matters. We also make sure that we're purposeful in our research. We faithfully represent ideas rather than specific details. These powerful stories deserve powerful tellings, but we're a lean team with a lean skill set, at least speaking for myself, and so we use simplicity with style, because even the basics can feel special if we package them well. And life is more than paint. So we let sound and motion help carry the load. The story needs to feel right to its kaitiaki, but changes take time, which is expensive. So we work together. We use client insight to make the work richer and milestone sign-offs to keep the work moving. And lastly, we feedback on feedback. We find the core problem at the source of the feedback and then use that to propose production-friendly solutions. Before we go into questions, I'd like to give a few quick thank yous. To Rereo Keroa Shaw for her consultation on this process, for Jade McCormack for her consultation and voiceover, to Brad Totorewa for permitting us to use the haka he composed for the Battle of Rangiriri reenactment, Port Waikato Holiday Park for partnering with us on the project, and New Zealand Māori Tourism for funding it. To AWS Startups for supporting this talk and sponsoring my travel to NZGDC. To my team at Ata Journeys for all their support and encouragement. Amber, Ben, Isaac, and James, you guys are awesome. And lastly, to the NZGDC organising team. Running an event like this is a boatload of work, and I hope you guys know how much your mahi is appreciated. But that's everything I've got in my slides, so we've got time for 8 minutes of Q&A if anyone had any questions. The things hanging from the ceilings are microphones, but we've also got one going around the room. In the front here?
Oh, hi. Thanks so much. At one point, I was coding a game that used some, really kind of standard game conventions like fog to sort of obscure elements that weren't loaded in yet. And then we discovered, of course, that fog wasn't appropriate from a cultural standpoint to represent the tone of the actual scenes. So I just wanted to ask if you've had any kind of similar examples where something that's sort of the conventions of the medium ends up being totally inappropriate, and then you have to find creative solutions around it.
Oh, man. I'm trying to think, because this was my first animation on this project. It's not culturally inappropriate stuff, but that was one of the big reasons why the lighting was so severe in that trailer, was just so that we could get away with limiting the amount of detail that we'd shown. Ben, you look like you've got some thoughts on that one. This is my manager, Ben.
It's not so much something that was offensive, but you'll notice that we tried to create those really juicy, Hollywood trailer style scripts because they're catchy. And that's really in direct, that's in direct contest with the way that these orators normally talk. And so that was something that happens a lot, but not so much with that one, with the other one more so.
Thank you, that's fantastic. Interesting. I just love it.
Does anyone have any other thoughts or questions? Over here.
Hi. I wanted to know if you had anything that you thought would be simple, like, there's this detail that's going to make it look very good, but turned out to be extremely challenging. And if so, what was that?
I really thought when I'd come up with that tech test for the carving that it was like, perfect, easy solve. This is going to look great. And I do think that where it came out is great, but I also think it still doesn't, like if you were to put a photo of the carving right next to it, you go, that is not quite how carvings work. But again, sometimes you've got to make compromises to meet the timing, right? It's about representing the idea rather than making sure that you're actually drawing the bevels and the lighting correctly. At least I got the shapes of the carving right, which in that moment felt like a good compromise.
Kia ora, Jess. I work for the New Zealand Film Commission in the Rautaki team. And one of the discussions that we're constantly talking about is story sovereignty. Mm-hmm. And I look around the room here and I'm wondering, how is that applying in your community, in the games community? Because, that's a big issue in this film and television community.
Absolutely. Ben's chomping at the bit to answer this one because he's more in control of those conversations than I am.
Of course. Really important question, really important. I will just go back to the first slide. Obviously, this talk with Jess, there's kind of 3 layers of consultation that we have. Sorry, I don't actually know who I'm talking to. Hi. We have the initial consultation, which usually happens at the top level, and then we've got the design intent conversations that happen at my level. So I do things like I sleep on the site and stuff like that, and then it comes down to Jess's level. This has been... This is quite a good one, but we've had some really rough ones. Yeah. The conversation in the room, I think that's a little bit beyond the scope of this particular talk and even my expertise, but I think it's very important to bring it up. Yeah. Sorry.
Our CEO, Amber, handles all that kind of stuff, and she really, I'm sure, would be more than happy to have a conversation with you about it too. So it's something that she feels really passionately about as well. Any other questions in the room? Awesome. I think we are pretty much bang on time. So thank you everyone for your time and for coming to my talk.